Okay, Dr. Dayton, if you'd like to start, go ahead.
Good morning, or as they say in Vietnam, Chào buổi sáng, which I probably mispronounced. Thank you all for being here. This morning I'm going to talk about diagnosing T-large granular lymphocytic leukemia in Vietnam. My disclosure is that all of my work in Vietnam is assisted by a nonprofit, a Minnesota nonprofit called Impact Health Vietnam, which is a Fairview Foundation partner. Although they certainly facilitate everything I do in Vietnam and provide translation services, I receive no financial compensation. What are my learning objectives? I'm going to discuss the limitations of making any laboratory diagnosis in a developing country and discuss how those limitations affect available published data and how that affects how our perception of how to make a diagnosis and what are the diagnostic criteria in developed countries. And I'm going to discuss the use of the 5th edition of the WHO diagnostic manual for diagnosis of T-LGL in Vietnam. Of course, because, again, to quote Dr. Hollyberg, I love this, that she said this in CP conference a few weeks ago, because you can't give a heme path talk around here without mentioning WHO heme 5. So I have to take you back in time a little bit to when some of you may not have even been born yet, 1975, which was when I was graduating from high school. And so this had a big impact on me, which was the unceremonious departure of the US military from Vietnam and assisting some of the Vietnamese who had assisted the US military to escape from that country very dramatically in 1975. And then from 1975 until the 1990s, when under the Clinton administration in the United States, normalization of relations with that country began to resume, there was just really no contact. And then I'm going to fast forward to 2014 when this woman, Yin Nguyen, who had started an organization, a nonprofit called Impact Health Vietnam in Minnesota, a partner with Fairview. She had in 1975 been in medical school in Paris, France, and dropped out of medical school to try to help some of her family members to effectively escape from South Vietnam to the United States. And she then went on to develop nonprofit service organizations to help Vietnamese still in Vietnam and in the United States. And she started working with University of Minnesota physicians to, once relations normalized, to bring University of Minnesota physicians to Vietnam to help bring them back to, well, effectively this millennium in healthcare. In 2014, she was contacted by a very wealthy American who proposed to leave his entire estate to Impact Health Vietnam if they could figure out a way to use the money effectively to facilitate treating and curing childhood leukemia in Vietnam. And what he was asking for was essentially an exploratory mission to Vietnam to find out if it was possible to treat and cure childhood leukemia in Vietnam. He was certainly, he had made his fortune in the import business, and so he didn't know a whole lot about diagnosing or treating leukemia. He just wanted to do this. And Yingwen, being the brilliant, really brilliant, industrious woman that she is, put together a team of a board-certified hematopathologist, actually on the faculty of University of Florida Medical School, Dr. Kim Chi Nguyen, who she knew through her Vietnamese American organizations, and through her contacts at Fairview, she found Dr. Troy Lund, a very distinguished faculty member in pediatric hematology, oncology, and BMT at the University of Minnesota. And she found me a hematopathologist working at the U. And she got us together, also with a couple of Fairview Peds HEMONC nursing staff, and got us to Vietnam, got us visiting the medical school in what is now called Ho Chi Minh City, formerly known as Saigon, Vietnam, and also had us visit the hospital, the proposed hospital, children's hospital in Saigon, where she proposed that they would be the hospital that would be diagnosing and treating children with leukemia with this wealthy man's donation. All right. And it was with the help of Dr. Troy Lund that I was able to craft this sentence for the report, because I don't have this level of diplomacy myself. Many of you know that. And in the report, I wrote, and I quote, "The selected Vietnamese hospitals for the proposed grant lack the critical infrastructure for diagnosis of childhood leukemia necessary for current curative therapies." What I really wanted to say, I think, was that they are suffering from cliaopenia. And for those of you trainees who maybe don't know what CLIA is, it's the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Act with amendments in the United States that the United States has been working on and from since the late 1970s, which have really, brought our country and our system and the University of Minnesota Medical Center to a pursuit of excellence, saving lives and protecting people in the United States by ensuring quality control and quality assurance and laboratory and medical education. All those things have brought us to where we are now. And those are all things that Vietnam missed missed out on, didn't have since the United States left in 1975. And so I thought that was the end of it. I thought that I was never going to have to go back to Vietnam again. But curiously, Roche Diagnostics and the communist government of Vietnam got Nguyen to get me and Dr. Chi Nguyen back to Vietnam with this idea that we were going to bring quality hematopathology diagnosis to Vietnam. We are seeing here with Dr. Ha, who the now retired but distinguished professor of pathology at the University Medical School and Medical Center in Ho Chi Minh City, otherwise known as Saigon, in the south of Vietnam, who had been the director of the Department of Pathology there since the 1980s. Okay, at any rate, and so I was convinced, along with Dr. Chi Nguyen, that we were going to go back and educate Vietnam pathologists in diagnostic hematopathology. And at some point, God bless him, Dr. Michael Linden said, Vanessa, if you're going to bring excellence in hematopathology to Vietnam, you have to be a little bit more excellent yourself, and you have to start documenting the heck out of things. And he convinced me to connect with Dr. Dan Milner at ASCP Center for Global Health to be more rigorous in documenting what the level of capabilities, diagnostic capabilities, the Vietnam pathologists had at baseline, and be more systematic in bringing hematopathology or any pathology education to Vietnam. And this resulted in this publication, Evaluation of Opportunities to Improve Hematopathology Diagnosis for Vietnam, published in the American Journal of Clin Path, I think in 2017. And in it, we tabulated, what the deficiencies were, and this led to me being permanently banned from the National Oncology Hospital in Hanoi, Vietnam, the north of Vietnam. And I thought that that would be the end of it. However, I was invited back in 2019 to South Vietnam, again, Saigon, to give a keynote presentation on actually using some research that Dr. Linden and I had done at the University of Minnesota, a keynote presentation at a Pan Southeast Asia Oncology Symposium. And at that time, I was approached by the new director of what's called the BTH or BTHH, the Blood Transfusion and Hematology Hospital of Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, of course, to tell me that he had selected a young man who had just finished his cytopathology fellowship after a pathology residency with Dr. Ha at the Ho Chi Minh City Medical University. But he had just finished his training, and the director of this hospital, in a very large and prestigious hospital in Saigon, had decided that this young man was going to work with me to bring diagnostic hematopathology to Vietnam. He was going to be dedicated to do that. This Dr. Lin, with a PhD in chemistry, was going to be the director of a flow cytometric immunophenotyping laboratory there, where they were going to purchase an 8-color BD flow cytometer. And yeah, that was December of 2019. Okay. And then what happened? The pandemic happened, and we were in the pandemic lockdown. And suddenly it occurred to me that I had been granted this magical technology by the University of Minnesota Medical School and Medical Center, Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology. I had been granted a Zoom account, Zoom, where I could be with anybody anywhere in the world, and anybody who had a microscope that was set up with a digital camera and a computer with good software like CellSense and high-speed internet with a good bandwidth. I could be looking at slides with this young Dr. Tien in Ho Chi Minh City at BTH, and that's how I could train pathologists in diagnostic hematopathology in Vietnam. And once again, reminded by Dr. Linden to be excellent, sometime by the beginning of 2021, I started documenting at least all the diagnoses that I was making for the BTH, the Blood Transfusion Hospital. But, other hospitals and pathologists from around the country were in Vietnam, were contacting me, and several nights a week I've been looking at cases with Vietnam. So that leads me to October of 2022, and it's just a routine night on Zoom with Dr. Tien at BTH, and he's showing me a bone marrow biopsy. And by this time, everybody in Vietnam knows the rules. You want to show Dr. Dayton a bone marrow biopsy. Well, you want to show her anything. You don't tell her any clinical history first. You just start showing her the slides. And for a bone marrow biopsy, you have to have a blood smear. And Dr. Dayton wants to look at the blood smear first. And just like she would be looking at it with a trainee in the United States, and then move on to a bone marrow core touch imprint or aspirate smear, and then core sections. And so this is a blood smear that I was shown. And as was quite usual, the quality of the blood smear was just obscenely bad. And that makes it even more difficult on Zoom. But I could tell that this patient had adequate platelets, but they were anemic, and they had maybe some funny looking lymphocytes, but the quality of the smear is just so bad. The quality of it's, has spent too much time, the blood spent too much time in EDTA. The smear preparation is bad. The drying of the blood smear is bad, too much humidity and not dried, carefully with a fan. The staining is bad. So, and look at all this junk and precipitate in the background. Okay, so bad blood smear, so can't say a lot. Okay, but I can tell the patient is anemic. So of course I want to ask for the CBC, and on the CBC, yes, the patient is anemic, but really no other clues on the CBC with automated differential count. One interesting thing is that there's a very low reticulocyte count. So obviously this person isn't making red cells. And when you look at the bone marrow touch prep, which also isn't that great, but believe me, the touch preps have gotten better, especially since I traveled to Vietnam specifically to show them how to perform bone marrow biopsies and how to make touch preps. I think that was in 2018. At any rate, but when you look at this touch prep and you look at several fields, even on Zoom with a little bit of time delay, anyone who I have trained, okay, or who trained at the University of Minnesota in hematopathology, anyone who trains at the University of Minnesota in hematopathology knows that when you look at a bone marrow touch prep or bone marrow aspirate smear, first thing you look for is to see if myeloid maturation is complete and orderly. And the next thing you make sure of is that erythroid maturation is complete and orderly. And there are no erythroid precursors to be found. In fact, maybe this is an erythroid precursor. It's immature. It doesn't look like the rare immature erythroid precursors with nuclear inclusions that you see in parvovirus, but this definitely looks like bone marrow erythroid aplasia, also known as pure red cell aplasia. When you look at the bone marrow core, this is a 68-year-old woman. It's about 25% cellular. It's normal cellular for age. It's also formalin fixed. In Vietnam, all bone marrow biopsies are fixed in formalin, no matter how hard I have tried to even teach them how to make the recipe for acetic acid zinc formalin. I just haven't gotten them there yet. And so, but on this formalin fixed core, I can see, after some practice on Zoom, I can see at low power that there appears to be some benign appearing interstitial lymphoid aggregates. And I can see it poorly fixed myeloid precursors and complete myeloid maturation, and normal numbers of megakaryocytes, but I can't see any significant numbers of erythroid precursors. So this is pure red cell aplasia. And whatever it was at 9 p.m., on an October evening in 2022, I was still able to rattle off for Dr. Tien all of the causes of pure red cell aplasia that I personally have diagnosed, some of them more memorable than others, having published them or having having to have arduously written up an IRB proposal that got approved. And, they break down to, you can see pure red cell aplasia in T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia. I've seen a couple of cases of that. Incidentally, one of these was a Vietnamese American and diagnosed at the University of Minnesota. Certainly seeing mature B-cell leukemia plus parvovirus, B-cell CLL treated with fludarabine, resolved with the pure red cell aplasia resolved with switching to another treatment modality. One case of newly diagnosed lymphoplasmacytic lymphoma, and where the pure red cell aplasia resolved with treatment of the lymphoplasmacytic lymphoma. These cases published patients on a CellCept study, where when the CellCept was removed, the pure red cell aplasia resolved. A Minnesota family who all had hereditary spherocytosis and who all got parvovirus at the same time. That was pretty spectacular. It all resolved with IV IgG. Sorry, at any rate, you get where I'm going with this. At any rate, so I have a way, that I think of working up pure red cell aplasia in bone marrow. First of all, I want to get some good history, because I might be able to, decide what my further testing strategy is from the history. Like the family with hereditary spherocytosis and parvovirus, it was looking at the blood smear and seeing spherocytes on all three family members' blood smears. That led to the recommendation of flow cytometry for the band 3 to confirm the diagnosis of hereditary spherocytosis and recommending PCR for parvovirus on the three family members. Certainly, yes. So in that interesting case, getting a good blood smear made all the difference, and flow cytometric and immunophenotyping, which you have to know what you're looking for, of course, on blood can be diagnostic. So for the, B and T cell leukemias, flow cytometric phenotyping on blood, and for the hereditary spherocytosis, the band 3. And then if I don't have these options, which are certainly not easy options for Vietnam, and particularly on Zoom, my recommendation is a way you can get started is just by ordering a CD3 and a CD20 immunoperoxidase stain, an equidarin, or some immunoperoxidase stain for erythroid precursors on the bone marrow biopsy core. Okay, you can get started with that, and get my Vietnam pathologist tracking down if there's any history that's going to be helpful to us. Okay, so they don't have equidarin at VTH in Vietnam, but they have CD71, which is just as good, and most hospitals that do immunoperoxidase have this. And on CD71, you could confirm that really all there are very few immature appearing erythroid precursors on the bone marrow core. CD3 highlighted those what looked like benign interstitial lymphoid aggregates, but hey, I was immediately struck by something that I always look for on a CD3 immunoperoxidase stain on a bone marrow biopsy, and that is these CD3 positive T cells lining up in the sinusoids, or even widening and packing into bone marrow sinusoids. It's really, if you've seen it before and you've trained yourself to see this pattern and think of a specific diagnoses, this is absolutely unmistakable. Okay. And the reason it is unmistakable for me, and I have trained my eyes to see it, is there was a decade in Minnesota when, God bless him, Dr. Tom Uncini was up there on the range performing bone marrow biopsies and signing them out with few words like anemia or neutropenia. and this is when everything north of the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul was the flow cytometry free zone. And Dr. Ancini would, perform these bone marrow biopsies, sign them out with few words, because he was a man of few, and still is a man of few words. And these patients would be referred down to the big city, to the University of Minnesota Medical Center for a second opinion. And they would bring their slides, bone marrow slides with them, but with no flow cytometric immunophenotyping. And it was, my responsibility and the HemePath staff's responsibility to look these over and to think, could this be T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia? But I don't have flow cytometric immunophenotyping. And we were so lucky, we were so blessed that the Mandalorians of hematopathology at early in this millennium, these Mandalorians of hematopathology in a galaxy not so far, far away, depending upon traffic on 35W South, they had put together a very nice series and published this paper explaining exactly how you can diagnose T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia with immunoperoxidase stains. And it was published in a journal that I only have ever aspired to publish in, called Blood. And the cool thing about, one of the many cool things about the journal, this journal, Blood, is that if you look the article up online, you can get a PowerPoint slide with the images, and there it is. There is the CD8 positive T cells packing the sinusoids, or here on the TIA1 lining up in the sinusoids. They say it's classic, and I believe them. Okay, and so I've got those CD3 positive T cells lining up in the sinusoids, and as one expects in T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia, you're going to have aberrant loss. You have a clone with aberrant loss of some other T-cell marker or markers. And here on the CD2, you don't see the T-cells lining up in the sinusoids. And so it seems that these cells express CD3, they lack CD2. Again, CD3, and there's histiocytes in the background here. And by the way, it's always helpful to compare, to have a benign lymphoid aggregate to compare the staining to. And you certainly see CD4 positive T cells in the benign lymphoid aggregate, but you do not see them, okay, certainly not lining up in the sinusoids here. So they don't express CD4. They don't appear to express CD5. They look like looks like there may be variable CD7. Certainly on the CD8, this is better than, I would say, the Mayo guys' image in their article for Blood. I mean, this is pretty darn nice. And I took this screenshot on Zoom, okay, of the CD8. So we have cytotoxic T cells, CD8 positive T cells, and we know they're T cells because they express CD3, and they also nicely express TIA1, just like the picture in the magazine, okay? So this has got to be pure red cell aplasia associated with T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia. If I were in the United States, I assure you that I would be recommending flow cytometric cell surface immunophenotyping on the blood to confirm the diagnosis, because that's how we do it. Okay, but I'm quite certain that that's what this patient has, is T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia. And I got an email, I don't know, maybe a day later, from Dr. Tien. BS stands for Bakshi, which is Vietnamese for doctor, and I'm probably mispronouncing everything about that. But he's saying that his oncology doctor has never heard of T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia. He wants a reference. Not a problem. I have a reference, okay, that I will show you in a moment, okay? And I sent that reference, and we got another email from Dr. Tien saying, the oncology doctor wishes me to write a case report of first Vietnam diagnosis of T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia for an English language journal. And my response was almost immediate. The answer is no, because it's not interesting enough for an English language journal. I mean, there's lots of published cases of T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia, and you know, most journals aren't even publishing. Well, good journals don't seem to be publishing case reports anymore. They want a series, which is 4 or more cases. A prospective series is really hard to get permission to do, and a retrospective series would be even harder, because even though since 2018, BTH hospital has had a searchable pathology report system. I mean, the question is, what search term would we use? It was too hard. No, we're not going to do it. Okay, so then, you know, life and Zoom go on. It's November, December of 2022, and I get a request to review a case or cases one, you know, evening, because our evening is their daytime, with BTH again. And I'm told that a 55-year-old who'd had a bone marrow biopsy at a different hospital back in February of that year, for evaluation of neutropenia, was you know, told that she had a normal bone marrow biopsy, and now this patient has come to BTH with her slides and is requesting an expert second opinion. And I looked at everything and I said, oh my gosh, you know what? Believe it or not, we have another case of T-LGLL. Isn't that interesting? Of course, worked it up much more completely, but I'm not going to take the time to show you all of her slides. Oh my goodness, a week later, a 44-year-old with unexplained anemia who has had a bone marrow biopsy at another hospital in South Vietnam, in this Saigon area, had been told that he had bone marrow erythroid aplasia without explanation, and now he's coming to BTH with his slides and his block, paraffin block, by the way, for both of these patients, requesting an expert second opinion. And by golly, just like the picture in the magazine, just like the previous cases, he's got T-LGLL too. And now, next, another patient. Okay, are you getting my drift? Look at this one. This is better than any of the other cases we've had so far, with, you know, and the picture in the magazine. Just absolutely classic. It's T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia. Well, now we've got 4 patients, and lo and behold, soon after, later in November, a 41-year-old Vietnamese female has come to this same oncologist at Blood Transfusion Hospital. She hasn't had a bone marrow biopsy before. She has unexplained anemia, and she actually has a slight lymphocytosis on her CBC with auto-diff, and she wants an expert opinion. And actually, the blood smear they made for this patient is actually marginally better, and you can find what look like uniform large granular lymphocytes, and she's got no erythroid precursors on her bone marrow touch prep. And this is how her stains show up, nicely lining up in the sinusoids on the CD8, those T cells, and nicely TIA1 positive. So she has a diagnosis of, oh, look, just a week or so, a couple of weeks later, 26-year-old showing up with marked anemia and thrombocytosis to the same oncologist. Actually, the blood smears are actually getting a little bit better. Large granular lymphocytes on the blood smear, pure red cell aplasia on the touch prep, and pretty nice, looks just right. And so we have made this diagnosis here. And get this, a 40-year-old man with unexplained anemia and very low reticulocyte percentage has shown up to the same oncologist at VTH in December of 2022, asking for a bone marrow biopsy with expert opinion. And he has specifically requested that the pathologist be told that his insurance, and they do have health insurance in Vietnam, will pay for flow cytometric immunophenotyping on his blood. He was very specific about the blood. Actually, much better blood smear. And you can see the large granular lymphocytes, pure red cell aplasia on his bone marrow touch prep. And just the classic immunostaining pattern on his core. And I just wanted to show that, by the way, again, CD3 cells lining up in the sinusoids. And I'm showing the CD5 here, knowing that, so to demonstrate by the immunohistochemistry that he has CD5 negative T cells, okay, that are likely the neoplastic T cells. Why is this helpful? Because this is what I can tell the tech who is gating the flow cytometric immunophenotyping. I can tell that tech to look for CD8 positive T cells that express CD3. Okay, so they're T cells that express CD3. They're CD8 positive, and they lack CD5. And that is the population that I want the tech to gate in the peripheral blood. Or if I got to do the flow cytometry myself, if I had the permission in Vietnam to do the gating myself, I would be gating on the CD5 negative T cell population, cytotoxic T cell population, so I could quantitate the neoplastic T cells, the T-LGLL cells in the peripheral blood. Well, this is Vietnam. And so they performed the flow cytometric immunophenotyping on the bone marrow aspirate. And of course, the insurance wouldn't pay for us also to do it on the blood because it had already been done on the aspirate. Yes, and the tech was able to find the CD5 negative T cells. But the panel that was done was a screening panel. It wasn't a T cell panel. And so I don't have the other markers that I want. And there you go. By the way, they are all cytotoxic T cells. And of course, the gating is done with Faxtiva, which, because Vietnam only having 2 clinical diagnostic flow cytometers in the country, they are in the Kaluza free zone. I hope to ameliorate that problem in the future, but haven't done it yet. Okay, so by this time, I'd figured out that there's probably some kind of citywide oncology conference in Ho Chi Minh City where the oncologist at BTH had likely boasted about diagnosing the first case of T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia in Vietnam. And so he had somehow created a retrospective, prospective, whatever situation where if I got permission, I could search for diagnoses of T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia in the over a 1-year period in the BTH pathology database, and I would have a series of 7. And while preparing to be in Vietnam in January, February, and March of this year, 2023, I was told by Impact Health Vietnam that the director of BTH and the oncologist wanted to meet with me to discuss with me publishing the series of the first 7 cases of T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia diagnosed in Vietnam. And I have to admit that up to this point in time, I had not even referred to the fourth edition, revised fourth edition of the WHO to make the diagnosis of T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia because, hey, you know what? I set up the first 2-color flow cytometer at the University of Minnesota Medical Center in 1990 for the specific purpose of assisting Dr. Richard Brunning to better diagnose cases of T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia because he was hoping to do his own publication. Okay, and I had used the Mayo Clinic paper from blood to diagnose cases of T-LGLL, and also, used flow cytometric immunophenotyping at the Health East hospitals, the VA, Minneapolis VA, the Health East hospitals, the U, Hennepin, where else? Had interpreted and dated the flow cytometry myself to make diagnosis of T-cell LGLL. And so I didn't think I needed the WHO's help. However, as I was getting ready to go to Vietnam, I had purchased the online 5th edition of the WHO. And in order to be rigorous, in order to be excellent, I felt like I needed to see what they had to say. And I saw that they, in their essential criteria, are kind of vague because you have to get 2 of these 3 requirements, okay? You have to have an increase in circulating cytotoxic T cells, often greater than 2 times 10 to the 9th, but maybe less. Okay, well, kind of hard to do for Vietnam because of the bad blood smear quality and because I clearly hadn't gotten flow cytometry on the blood. You need a T-cell population with downregulation of CD5 and or CD7 and or abnormal expression of CD16 and NK-associated receptors. Well, that's easy. I had that on immunohistochemistry and evidence of T-cell monoclonality or oligoclonality. Well, you know what? I'm never going to get T-cell receptor gene rearrangements in any reasonable amount of time in Vietnam. You can get them there, but not in a reasonable amount of time. And they're expensive and they're for Vietnam. And so I'm not going to get that. But I thought, you know what? I can interpret that this clearly aberrant T-cell immunophenotype is evidence of a clone. So I could get these 2 criteria for all 7 of my cases, okay? And that's all you need is 2 of these 3 essential criteria and in association with 1 desirable criteria. And you know what? You gotta know who the editor is of this section in the book, because this is right out of a Mayo Clinic paper from the early 2000s, okay? And I definitely had demonstrated that for all 7 cases, okay? So I have the first 7 cases of T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia diagnosed in Vietnam. Okay, and by the way, I couldn't help but go on, reading. I like to read the whole section of something if I'm going to read it in the WHO whatever edition. And I saw that they said only rare patients present with pure red cell aplasia and anemia. I thought, kind of one of the features of my paper or my series is that 6 out of 7 have pure red cell aplasia. In fact, that's how we were able to make the diagnosis in Vietnam, was because I knew the differential diagnosis of pure red cell aplasia, diagnosed index case number 1, and then brought in the rest of the cases. And I thought, well, that's odd. And I noticed, of course, the responsible author was Dr. Morris from the Mayo Clinic. And I really liked this idea where you can send feedback. And so I sent this paper to Dr. Morris, and I've just got to tell you that as of the beginning of April, Dr. Morris changed rare to pure red blood cell aplasia is seen in a minority of cases. Wait a minute. I sent him the paper. Okay, I sent him this paper. And by the way, I know I've been accused of just reading the abstracts of papers that I recommend, but wait a minute. That's not true. I did not send this paper, which was a long story why I had this paper in my file in my laptop under T-LGLL. I had read this entire paper actually several times before I sent it to Dr. Morris, and in part because it's kind of a special and historic paper. In this paper, the authors describe 22 Chinese patients seen at their hospital, okay, Hong Kong St. Mary's, between 1996 and 2009. And this is kind of special and historic, okay, those of you who grew up reading and still read the New York Times, know that 1997 was the big trade-off, okay, where Hong Kong was returned from its long tenure of British rule to Chinese rule. And so this is kind of a special time period that these doctors at St. Mary's Hospital in Hong Kong did this retrospective slide review of 22 Chinese patients diagnosed with T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia. Okay, they were able to find 88 additional patients in 20 published medical journal articles, mainly published from hospitals in China, including their own hospital. Okay, previous retrospective review. And also Japan. So most of the Asian papers come from China and Japan, and that brought them up to 100, 100 plus patients for their Asian arm of this study. And then they included review of 5 medical journal articles, which they called as from Western, quote unquote, Western countries, that included 272 patients, okay, in just 5 medical journal articles. Well, this doesn't mean that this is more common in Western countries. These 5 medical journal articles are from the big players in hematopathology from the United States and Britain. And, so from Britain, the big paper, it was, from, 2 gods of hematopathology, the B in the FAB of the French American British classification system, which is Dr. Kotowski, and his, I think of her as his first lieutenant, Dr. Estella Matutes. Okay, so a large series from the United Kingdom, published by them, those 2 superstars, and the most current from MD Anderson, which is just an excellent, a really outstanding retrospective slide review study and clinical information published in Leukemia Research in 2007 from MD Anderson. Okay, so the Asian papers, okay, but the Western papers are really from the big players. And their tables and charts in the publication are, a little bit tedious and hard to read, so I've simplified it. Okay. In the Asian papers, 91% of their cases had greater than 2,000 per microliter LGLs, either by flow cytometric immunophenotyping or by morphology in the peripheral blood. And in fact, really for both, if you carefully read all of the series, all of the papers involved here, this is how most of the cases were picked up. A patient with anemia or a patient with neutropenia and a lymphocytosis that was predominantly large granular lymphocytes. Okay. And that's how most of these cases were picked up, and these patients ended up having bone marrow biopsies. Okay. Interestingly, it was more typical in the Asian studies versus the Western studies for the bone marrow biopsy to be performed because of anemia, and more typical in the Western papers for the bone marrow biopsy to be performed for workup of neutropenia. Okay, so a really striking and statistically significant difference. Okay, anemia in Asians, neutropenia in the Western publications, and a striking difference in pure red cell aplasia as the presenting finding in the bone marrow biopsy between Asia and Western countries. And, I can't say from reading the papers. I certainly know from my small Vietnamese series that it was noticing the pure red cell aplasia that led to making the diagnosis. And I don't think that that's what was going on here in these Asian papers. I definitely think that these patients had bone marrow biopsies because of the combination of anemia and increased numbers of LGLs in their blood. So it's really a striking difference between the two. And, a striking difference in patients with neutropenia. Definitely in the Western series, there's a high percentage of patients who also have rheumatoid arthritis with, but also met the diagnostic criteria for the time for LGL leukemia. And also kind of a striking difference in response to therapies. Inexpensive therapies, cyclophosphamide or cyclosporin. Oops. All right. So just going back to this paper, something that, so this is the big important reference of a prior series, okay, that is cited, and I don't know what happened there, that is cited in this paper. Okay, the big prior series was also from the St. Mary's Hospital in Hong Kong. It was before the handoff, before the transition to the Chinese Communist government control. And it shares some of the same authors with the more recent paper that I've just cited, who were trained by British hematopathologists. And so they knew their way around the diagnosis of T-large granular lymphocytic leukemia, and they published their 9-case series from their hospital, which was also a retrospective slide review, in American Journal of Clinical Pathology in 1995, which, by the way, is where I published my first big series of a retrospective review of patients with Burkitt lymphoma involving blood and/or bone marrow in American Journal of Clin Path in 1994. But that aside, okay. And these same authors noticed a relationship between pure red cell aplasia and T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia, and actually published a separate paper. The same authors published a separate paper in Journal of Clinical Pathology in 1998. Okay, so what if I add my tiny series of 7 patients from Vietnam with these sort of biased way of finding and making the diagnosis? Well, it's kind of hard to enumerate the LGLs without a good blood smear and without flow cytometry on the blood on Zoom, but I sure could try if I thought that it was worthwhile. And how do our 7 cases line up? Well, all of the patients started treatment on a combination of cyclosporin and methotrexate. They all started at the end of February. And so far, 2 of them have had complete resolution. One patient with with neutropenia has had complete resolution of her absolute neutrophil count. And one patient with pure red cell aplasia now has a reticulocytosis and anemia has completely resolved. But we're still following up. Okay. And as far as pure red cell aplasia, yes, I realize that there is a bias to the diagnosis, but clearly this seems to be something striking in Vietnamese, and I would hope that anyone who looks at a bone marrow biopsy anywhere in the world and sees pure red cell aplasia, thinks about T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia in the differential diagnosis, whether they have a lymphocytosis or not. Only one of our patients had a lymphocytosis by, and it was slight, by automated differential count. And, actually, similar to the Asian series for everything else. Okay, I was trying to think of a title for my next slide. What are the barriers to excellence of the small Vietnam series? Okay, is this a complete waste of time? No, I don't want to say that. No, let's move on and say, what are the limits to this or any hematopathology research in Vietnam? And the list is too long to enumerate, but I think one large piece of it is that the number of Vietnamese physicians with rigorous subspecialty training in diagnostic hematopathology currently working in Vietnam equals 0. All right, and the number of well-trained, and I was well-trained by Dr. Richard Brunning, by Dr. Luann Peterson, Dr. Robert McKenna, Dr. John Strickler. I feel like I had really good training and really great mentors in hematopathology. And I have had a long career, most of it working part-time, I admit. The number of rigorously trained board-certified hematopathologists doing Zoom with Vietnam, the number is 1. That's me, okay? But so many limitations on so many levels in this economy that is really rapidly emerging, okay? That went from a certainly what the World Bank was calling, one of the most deprived economies just a few years ago, and now they have reclassified as an emerging economy. Okay, so is there any value to publishing this series? Well, could raise awareness of volunteer or maybe low cost? Do we see a business model here for the University of Minnesota? Consultation, expert consultation and education via telemedicine for developing economies. Supporting medical research in a resource limited country. It was Minnesota, along with California, that welcomed the Vietnamese diaspora after 1975. And hey, could we be seen as a leader in helping this emerging economy of Vietnam, debilitated by a US-driven conflict years ago, become a leader like China has become in hematopathology research? I definitely think anything that we can do to encourage anyone looking at bone marrows, that when they see pure red cell aplasia, think of T-LGLL is not a bad thing to do. And encouraging all pathologists to, without inappropriate bias, to consider that there may be variations in presentation of both common and uncommon diseases based on ethnicity. I want to thank everyone. I know I've hit my time stamp, but I want to thank all of you for attending this Grand Rounds, all of you. And I want to thank everyone at the University of Minnesota and the Medical Center and Fairview that has supported my work and teaching at the University of Minnesota for all of these years. Yes, I will stay on as long as anyone has any thoughts or any questions. Thank you all so much.
Well, Vanessa, I'm going to jump in because that was a fantastic presentation. And I actually have a couple of questions. Number one, I'm assuming that the CD8 positive killer cells are the ones that are killing off the red cell precursors, and in your one case, the white cell precursors. And I'm wondering if NK leukemias do the same thing. And the second question has to do with your last slide. I've had the privilege of visiting a number of labs in developing countries, including Uganda and Namibia, and the level of pathology support in these countries is horrendous. And there is a huge opportunity, and I would say a responsibility for pathologists in our country to actually help to improve laboratory medicine in all these countries, not just Vietnam. And I'd like to hear your impression of that, or your comments about that.
To address the first point that you brought up, I am very sorry that you missed my CP conference yesterday, where I discussed that the current theory about why some T-cell large granular lymphocytic leukemia patients present with pure red cell aplasia. Some present with
yeah, I did miss it. I'm sorry.
Phagocytosis. Okay, why some present with neutropenia. The current theory is that it has something to do with T cells binding to macrophages, inducing production of certain cytokines.
Right. Okay. Gotcha.
Right? And so depending upon what cytokines are produced, those cytokines might cause, erythroid maturational arrest.
Right.
And okay, all right, or it could cause neutrophil precursor destruction or mature neutrophil destruction. Okay. Sorry, addressing the second one thing. There have been, so I also have worked in Peru, Uganda, Cambodia, Burundi. I can't remember, whatever. Those are the ones I can think of. I can remember every diagnosis of pure red cell aplasia I've met, but I'm losing track of which countries I have had the privilege of visiting. And Zoom has been almost magical. And I honestly, I hope Dr. Furt is on this call. It really seems to me that if we can offer expertise to developing countries or specific hospitals in areas of developing economies and start out by volunteering our services on Zoom, that we then can provide a very cost-effective and potentially lucrative consulting service that also is educational, because we're teaching as we're looking at the slides with their pathologist, and we are telling them what we're thinking and how to work it up. We are educating them, and we're providing a consultation service. So theoretically, we could figure out some way to bill for it. Dr. Furt?
I'm not sure he's here. So just
people are dropping off anyways.
Yeah, just one last.
Dr. Colleen? Dr. Colleen, your thoughts on monetizing this? Okay, he's not there either.
No. Just one last comment. I was very intrigued by the fact that 20% of some of these patients have rheumatoid arthritis, and I would venture that many of these countries could use help in some clinical immunology diagnosis as well.
Actually, no. So it's in the U.S. studies that there's
I know, not in your studies, but
not in the Asian studies, and
but they may not have been diagnosed.
They may not have been diagnosed. That's a really good point. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take this offline. It is 6 minutes after. Thank you once again, Dr. Dayton, for helping us out today.
Thank you.